Hello and welcome to another Web Rough Cuts. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do a few simple layout things with Flexbox. So here is where we stand with this DAH Solutions site. You may recall the mockup looked like this. And here's where we are right now. We have applied the content styles, which is typically the first step that I walk through. And we've also begun to apply some of the box model styles to get the background image here, to space the text so that it's in the right space inside of that box, and to apply some of the different background colors and text effects as a result. We have also set up this page so that it centers as a whole in the browser. So a couple of reminders. First of all, centering the page in that way is a matter of setting a width and auto margins on left and right on the body tag, and this is the way I typically do that. So that's the effect there, and the background setup over here in the header was accomplished with these background settings, and then I pushed the text around simply using some padding that I measured from my mockup. I also made sure to use box sizing border box so that that padding did not affect the overall width and height but functioned inside of width and height. And one last note is that I also fixed the height of this box, but that is not something I usually do for most elements. Every now and then a header like this can have a fixed height so that it stays where it needs to and fills the space that it needs to. But we typically don't set heights on other elements so that they are flexible and flow as the content inside of them flows. So now, what do we need to do next? Well, we need to essentially build out the rest of the layout, which involves setting elements side by side in columns or tiles. There's many ways to do this. There's many ways to look at these things. But to demonstrate this, let's start down here with these logos, where we have a few more items to work with to demonstrate some of these basic concepts. So what we're going to do is show you how to use the Flexbox settings to bring about some layout effects. So for example, let's watch what happens when we apply Flexbox to this area. So we need to note the structure. With Flexbox, the structure is very important in that we need to make sure we note a container and then items within a container that will be forming the columns or tiles. So the UL that's inside of About Customers is going to be our container, and then the items will be the list items inside of that. So the About Customers UL is the container. That's where we would go and set display to flex. Now with that set, watch what happens by default. Notice how those elements are no longer stacking up and down. They are now stacking in here side by side. In fact, they're being squeezed in such a way that they really don't all fit. Let me put a border on each of those items, which is of course About Customers LIs here, right? So we're going to put a 1 pixel solid red border. And this is a little trick you'll pick up as you're working with layout. To put a border on something really helps you kind of get a sense of where it is. And so you can temporarily put borders on as you're working with things. So with those red borders on, notice that what happened is they all tiled up side by side. In fact, they tiled up in such a way that they tried to squish and fit. Now, this one extends beyond the width of the body tag, which is a little bit awkward. And so this default behavior is not always what we want. So what we're typically going to want to do is provide some additional settings on the container, as well as some more settings on the items themselves. So for example, if I don't want them to all squish, but I want them essentially to wrap like words would at the end of a box, I can set the flex flow, which is a shorthand for several other properties, and we want to set it in the row wrap setting. So this is telling it to behave like a row, which is the default, but we're adding on to that default behavior that we also want it to wrap when the items don't fit neatly on a line. So with that in place, notice now we don't squish them all in anymore, but one of them overflows down to the next line. Okay, so that's good. We're off to a start. But now if we wanted to space them out a little bit more, we need to move on to doing that with the items themselves. So let's just keep it simple for now. This is actually a complex solution that we'll come back to after we've done a few more practice things, but it's an easier place to start than the others. So just to give an example, we're going to go in here and say, what if they were all 25% wide? That means that we'd be able to fit 4 of them together, and then there would not be room for 3, and so those remaining 3 would bump down to the next row. Okay, so 25% wide. Okay, so notice now that the width of those list items has changed. The images inside of them are not being scaled. Only the list items have been set to that width, so the images are kind of sitting in the left side of those LIs. Okay, but the result then is that we get a little bit more like a tile kind of a setup where we're influencing the size of the items, and the consecutive items are just wrapping onto the next rows, and it's a pretty nice effect. Okay, so why don't all 4 fit like we thought they would? Well, this is one of those little tricks that is easy to forget if you're new to things, and that is that the border, as well as margin and padding, are added onto width by default. So these items are not really perfectly 25% wide. They're actually 25% plus 1 pixel on each side, which makes them just a little bit too big to fit. So another situation where we change this by setting box sizing to border box. And now that border will act inside of the width rather than adding onto it. And we should now fit the 4. Okay, so we're on the right track in that we've got 4 on one row and 3 on the next row, but they're not. There's lots of other things we could do to actually space them correctly. And so this is where we move back to the container to affect the spacing settings for the whole set of elements. And we have some options such inside of the justify content setting, and the default here is flex start. So let me just change the width of these elements just a little bit so that they're not squeezed so tight. 20%, boy. Yeah, instead of width, let me just add a little bit of margin on the side. So 20% and then a little bit of margin right. Let's do 10 pixels. That should be enough. Okay, enough to show you that now there's some space to deal with. I know this is not the full solution we're looking for, but we're demonstrating concepts at this point. So flex start is the default, but you also have options such as space between. All right, what space between does is takes any space remaining on a row and distributes it evenly between any of the items in that row. Justify content, got to spell it right. All right, so now you see that the 4 at the top are evenly spaced and the 3 at the bottom are evenly spaced, but the space is different for each row because there was a different amount of space left on each row when we started. Okay, so that's one effect that might be helpful, especially when you have elements on a row that you want even spacing for, which we might run into in a place like this or in a place like this. Space between can be pretty helpful. One of the other settings we have is space around, which does a similar idea, except it makes sure that the space around each item is the same. So basically takes that leftover space that was over here and distributes it evenly between the left and right side of each item. So the result here is you get a little bit more like the typical gutter effect that we have in layouts. And of course you can see that same idea applied down here. We also have a really handy setting called center. And this takes that space that was extra and puts it only on the outer sides of each of the rows. So this is actually maybe closest to what we have here, but really still not quite what we're after. Nonetheless, you've seen some of the basic ideas demonstrated. Let's review them. First of all, you set display flex on a container. Then you might also want to set flex flow row wrap if you have a more of a tile kind of setup to ensure that any items that don't fit on a row will wrap nicely. I end up defaulting to this because it works so well in so many settings. Then we move down to the items, where we controlled some of the box model settings on those items, simple things like width and margin and box sizing border box, and we even added this red border just to keep track of where we were. Then we circled back up to the container and played around with the spacing between the items using the justify content center in this case. Now we're going to come back to these and do more, but let's take these same ideas and try to accomplish some of these other layout areas. So one of these areas is up here in this dark brown box where we have two columns, two tiles of content sitting right side by side. All right, so I'm going to want to just go take a look at my markup and kind of figure out what's going on there. Hopefully, I have a container around both of those things, which I do in that I have this product details container here. In fact, I think I have one more container than necessary. I don't think I need this container right here because the section that is here already contains the elements, and there was an extra layer between here and the two groups. So these are, so we've done the first part. We've established that we have one container around both of the elements. Now we want to make sure that directly inside of that container we have containers around the groups of content that we want to tile up. So if we had the H2 and the paragraph directly inside of here, and the H3 and the UL also directly inside of here without these divs, we're going to run into a lot more hassle than we need to when we can simply put some nice little divs around these to group them. Okay, so we have a group for the left side and a group for the right side. All right, see how that works out? So I'll be on the right track if I go and select my product class, which I have selected here and already have a few settings. So I'm going to go right on here. This is my container on which I add the display flex setting. All right, so with display flex set, look at that. They automatically line up and begin to try to accomplish the effect that we want. But the widths are nowhere near what we want. In fact, they're almost reverse of what we want. So I'm going to go back to my comp and select those elements and figure out what my width should be. They're not exactly the same width, so I'm going to go with the widest element, which appears to be this paragraph here. And I can see it's set to 375 pixels wide. There's no reason where I wouldn't want this one to also be 375. But one other thing to note is that I also make a practice of using a grid, which in Sketch you can turn on or off, or a layout actually is what it's called here. Using the show layout option, I also use the keyboard shortcut Control L to toggle it, and you can also play with your layout settings here by adjusting these values. So it's worth noting that I don't just have an arbitrary width here. I have actually aligned these items with my grid. In fact, this one is 5 columns wide. This one is 7 columns wide. That's a little bit different, I know, but it's fun to be different sometimes, eh? Well, so all that to say, 375 pixels is not arbitrary. It is 5 of the 12 columns that I have in this layout. Okay, so all that to say, 375 pixels is where we're going to start by saying the product, or let's see, the details description needs to get that width because it's an item inside here. Oops, I actually need to so it's now trying to be narrower, but there's something else going on here. Because we haven't yet set the width here, Flexbox does some strange things sometimes if you are leaving it to its kind of normal squishing everything into the box sort of setup. So I realized that I forgot a moment ago to add the Flex Flow row wrap. and then elements will actually have the settings that you instruct them to. So notice what happened here is that the 375 pixels width is now set up, and by the way, I like to use the inspector to check things out as I go. I like to put it down here because I can click on the box and I can see, oh yeah, 375 pixels. But what's going on with this guy? Well, when you use FlexFlow row wrap, the elements inside of the container, in this case the products container, will take up as much space as they need and then wrap along rows afterwards. So this one is told to be 375 pixels. But because this one is not told to be any particular width, it takes up basically the full width because that's how much space it needs in order for all of the text to fit. And then the text just wraps when it's out of room. So we're going to finish this out by getting the actual correct width on that element, which I can again look at here and determine the widest thing is this group of list items, and that's 545 pixels. So that was the details features. Width 545. Okay, now they both fit together and we can circle back up and adjust the spacing. So on one hand, I could simply enforce the spacing by putting some right margin on this one or left margin on this one to force them apart, but I'd rather stay flexible and use the flex box. So that's where we're going to go to the product container one more time and set the justify content to space between. Remember, that's the one that said let's take the extra space over here and put it evenly between the two items. And since there's only two, the effect is that it will force the items kind of away from each other. So space between, and we accomplished the layout effect we're after. Okay, so we can simply repeat that same idea down here with this box. We'll have a couple of little different things to work with. But so notice that it's switched on this this time. We have the 7-column wide thing on this side and the 5-column wide thing on the other side. But so we'll use a lot of the same principles here for sure. So the about box needs to get the flex box setting. So here's about, display flex. And we'll go ahead and turn on flex flow row wrap. And we'll go ahead and, since we know we're headed this way, we're going to do the justify content space between. So we're all set up and ready. Okay, I forgot to mention that the customers item is also down here. And let's note that the customers item, whereas these two items need to tile up side by side, the customers item should fall down below them and should span the whole width of the container. Which is kind of happening already just because I have used row wrap and they're all kind of doing their normal thing right now. So let's go in and specify the width. We have about text and about testimonials. About text needs to be the width of 545 pixels, and about testimonials needs to be width of what was it, 375? That must not have been the right setting. 375, 545. Oh, it's a singular testimonial. Okay, good. So that was pretty easy, right? We've overall got those layouts working out right. Okay, before we tackle the trickiest one, let's talk about this footer, where you see in the comp we have essentially 3 columns. Each of them is roughly going to be 290 pixels wide. That's 4 columns in my layout here. Okay, but let's take a look at the markup though, because here we have a good semantic markup in place that we probably want to pay attention to. It is that we have a footer, and the footer contains 2 elements. a UL that contains the staff and another div that contains the footer text, which is the copyright and the partnership statement and things like that. So if we want to get these all to line up, it's important to note that what we really have, first of all, is two columns. We have one column or tile that contains the staff, and we have another column or tile that contains the copyright information, like this. Then, inside of this, we break it down further, and we have a container that has two columns, like this. Okay, so I'm just going to lay those back over the top of it and put their transparency on so you can see the idea like that. Okay, and let me also turn the layout off. Okay, so that's the idea. We really have to start with two outer columns, the staff and the copyright, and then we'll move inward and do another set of columns inside of the staff to accomplish these two tiles here. So let's take a look at making that work. First of all, we have footer. Footer is the outer layer where we're going to put display, flex, flex flow, row wrap, and we're going to do the justify content space between. Okay, now footer staff needs a width, and that width should be about 630 pixels wide. All right, let's see, and then we also need the footer text, I believe it was. Yep, footer text, width of 290 pixels. Okay, so now we've accomplished that first step of having these two items in the footer tiling up beside each other. Good deal. Now we just need to move in one layer so that we can make the LIs inside of this UL here tile up as well. So that's where we're going to now add onto the footer staff, in addition to that width, we're going to tell it to also be display flex. So you can really do nested flexbox things like this. And I'm going to copy and paste my settings this time, be a little smarter. And now the list items themselves are what need some settings, and I believe they each need a width of 290. Okay, so now our layout is overall in great shape, and we can say that's the end of the simple introduction to these things. But let's take a look at this a little bit more complicated space right here so that you see we can also do some more intricate things with Flexbox. So let's examine, or let's talk about what's going on in the actual layout here. I'm going to get rid of my guides first. Okay, so in the actual layout, we have 4 elements on the first row, 3 elements on the next row, and there should be a little bit of a gap between them. Looks like 20 pixels. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on just to have the spacing there. And that's going to be margin bottom, 20 pixels. Okay, good, we got that space. All right, back to the work here. Now, so how are they being spaced? Well, essentially what I did is I said, let's take these 4 elements and let's put one at the very outermost edge and the 4th at the very opposite edge, and then let's evenly distribute the others in between. So if I hover over and hold Alt and put my cursor on the next one over, you can see that they're attempted to split them evenly. It's just that they're not all, they don't fit evenly because it ends up with a half pixel. So there's 132 pixels in between this middle one. Okay, so what did I do on the next row? Well, I did a similar thing, but I just moved them in by 1 column. Okay, then they are evenly spaced otherwise, but that space is different from what it is on the line above. In fact, this one, oops, this one's actually not quite centered there, is he? So I'm going to show you how to do that in Sketch. With the items selected, you can click this button and it centers them again. Woohoo! Okay, so 118-ish is the distance on the bottom row, and it's more like 130 on the top row. So we can't just say I want a consistent setting on each of them. But what I could at least do is start by saying I want at least 108 pixels between them. The other thing is I do not have their widths all the same size as I did here. So I'm going to pull off the width, and I'm going to say margin right 100. Let's keep it simple and go 115. Instead of using a strange number, I'm going to kind of round that. Okay, so notice now that with that setting, only 3 items fit on the first row, which is one problem we'll address. But we also still have that justify content center going, and I think what I'm going to want in the end is the space between once again. Those auto settings like space between and center are nice, but they can sometimes let us get in trouble. Okay, so the result now is that I've got this guy where I want him, but I'm not fitting all onto one row. And that is because by the time we get to the third, we're really running out of space. Well, sorry. Let me just do flex start here to make it clearer. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so now you can see when we do flex start, all we have is the width plus the margin that we put on these. Width plus margin. And the result then is that there's not enough space for this element and his margin. There's probably enough space for this element, but no margin. So if we could go on and select this item and cancel his margin, he would probably fit here. And then we could turn on that space between setting, and the space would be calculated simply from there. So how do we go about removing this guy's margin? Well, one thing you could certainly do is find that element and put a class on it, on the li, and use that class as a hook to remove its margin. But whenever we can do something as simple straight in CSS without having to modify our markup anymore, that would be the preference. So we actually have another kind of pseudo selector that allows us to select the first child. There's another one that allows us to select the last child, and we also have the ability to select any child in between with a funny one called nth child, and then we specify which child we want to select. So this one is not the first child or the last child, but it is the fourth child, hence nth child. So we're going to want to select the fourth child li. So that's the about customers li. That is the nth child. Which child? The fourth child. And we can say margin right 0. Okay, so now you see we canceled this guy's right margin, and he does fit in here now. All right, so if we switch back to the space between setting, just for a moment, you see that the first row is looking exactly the way we want it, where the outer one is hugging here, and we only have 4, each as wide as they need, okay? But the second row is still not quite right. We could do the same idea to make some progress, and that would be to select the last item and remove its right margin. But let's do it one better. Let's think a little bit more about this. First of all, the first item on the second row isn't quite right. It really needs some margin offset as well. Well, how much? I'm going to just actually measure that with a little rectangle here. Looks like about 85 pixels is what we need. So I'm going to go and I'm going to make sure to push that that fifth item. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? The nth child of 5. I'm going to push him over from the left using margin of 85 pixels. Okay, so that kind of goofed things up over here, but once again, only because all those elements don't quite fit. So we've got the right offset over here. Now what we need to do is once again go to this item and cancel that right margin like we did up here with the fourth item. This time though, I'm going to use the last child rather than the nth child, and margin right of 0. Okay, so we've got it to fit, but now we realize, oh, we don't actually want 0. We actually want it to be pushed over by about 85 pixels. So margin right, 85 pixels. And let's pull that border off. Okay, and this is where that arbitrary thing that we set of 115 pixels might actually be getting in the way now. So let's reduce that to 110, and now you can see they fit. All right, so it was really the space between, but we actually also needed a little bit of extra margin on the left and right down here. But if we just had that, then we would probably have ended up with more up here. So we needed a little bit of margin to also kind of force them to separate the way we wanted. Okay, so suffice to say, there are lots of tricks and techniques that you learn as you gain more experience with this. Thankfully, you shouldn't need to be doing any fancy layout things like this in your project, but only doing some simple column-like effects like this, and we'll have some guides to walk you through those. Just to be encouraging, remember that with most things in life, the more you do them, the more you understand them. And so sometimes you just need to practice in order to get to know all of the different techniques. It is that way when we get to start working with layout. Lots of different ways to do things, lots of little challenges that can come up, but the more you do it, the more you practice, the more you figure out some patterns, and the easier it gets. Good luck.